Hello, everyone. Joining me now, Carolyn Dupont, a historian from Kentucky. And it's amazing. I found her through the world of social media, and she found me. And we want to focus on the Electoral College. There's so much information that's out there left and right. And we just want to talk about this. And why did you contact me? Carolyn, you saw a recent video I did. Just kind of want
Yeah.
to lay out the truth behind the history.
Yes. So in that particular interview, your guest said a number of things that were false or misleading or gave the wrong impression. And it struck me as quite an agenda-driven
Okay.
presentation. And I think when people don't have an agenda, they're a little freer to come to the historical sources and let the sources speak to them. And if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to say a word about that to start with,
Yeah.
because I know that I see on your Twitter feed and many Twitter feeds, and I know this is a huge concern of Americans right now, is that the zone is flooded with information and we can't tell always. We're not always equipped to evaluate that information. And in history, I like to tell my students that in history, we have a method for ascertaining the truth about the past. Just like in science, there's the scientific method. I know you've heard of that, and your listeners will have heard of that. And,
Mhm.
and that means that there are ways for setting up experiments, ways for evaluating the data, ways for multiple trials and things like that that lead you to get closer to something that's true. And we actually have that in history as well. And I could talk a long time about it, but I'll just say two things about it. Number one, in history, we always must have evidence from the sources at the time. We don't get to pull out of thin air what we think Thomas Jefferson thought or Alexander Hamilton thought. We don't get to impose upon them what we wish they had thought. We have to let them tell us. So that's number one, is we have to have the evidence. But number two, we don't pull quotes out of their context, because you can make the framers, you can make any historical figure say almost anything. And
True.
so we have to put every bit of evidence that we bring to this conversation in the context of the text, in the context of the situation in which it was spoken, in the context of other things that that person may have said at different times, because people change, or something sounds one way in a certain context and different in another, and even in the political, social, economic, religious context of the time. So
Yeah.
it's really a layered kind of thing that we're doing. And I just wanted to underscore that, because if you do those things, you will get closer to something that's true in history. And in this case, the truth about the Electoral College.
Let me start by asking, there might be watching people having a variety of education, background on the
Yeah.
Electoral College, but very basic. What is the Electoral College? When did it begin?
Well, it's written into the Constitution, which of course
Yes.
was written in 1787, ratified in 1788. But so maybe this is a good place to start. Do you mean the Electoral College that we use today, or the one that the framers put in the
Yep.
Constitution? Because
Let's
they're
go
not the
back.
same.
Yeah, let's go back to the one the framers put into the Constitution.
Yeah. So what they designed was essentially, I like to use the word proxy election, but maybe if people aren't comfortable with that word proxy, it's a situation where I choose someone whom I know and trust because they've been involved in government, and I deputize them. They are making that decision for me. And
Okay.
yes, and how do I know that? Well, I know it because of the sources. I've got right here one of my favorites, James Madison's notes, about 600 pages of the notes he took during the Constitutional Convention.
Yeah.
And if you read Alexander Hamilton's Federalist 68, you see he describes it this way, that electors should be chosen for their wisdom and discernment. And we don't choose electors for their wisdom and discernment today. We choose them for their party affiliation. And that is one of the ways that the Electoral College has dramatically changed. And
Hmm.
so I'll just say that was one of the things that bothered me that your guest did the other night, was just to collapse this idea that over 200 years of historical college evolution has taken place since 1789, when we had the first presidential election. And it's not at all the same. And so to defend today's electoral college, you are not defending the system that the framers created.
Now, over time, oh, I'm hearing my voice in the background.
That's
there.
all right.
Okay. How did it evolve?
Okay, well, the first way is that electors began pledging in advance to whom they were going to vote, for whom they were going to vote, excuse me. And sorry, I've got a hair. One of the things that happened that that we don't often talk about very much is that very bitter, rigid, polarized, toxic political parties, not unlike today, arose very, very quickly in the early United States. In fact, in George Washington's first administration. And these political parties shaped the Electoral College to their will. And what began happening is that people began pledging, if chosen as an elector, they would vote for Thomas Jefferson or John Adams. And that system was already in place by 1800. The second thing that changed dramatically was what we call the system of winner take all. And I believe your guest a few weeks ago described this as the vote being aggregated. But he didn't mention that's not how it was originally set out to be. Originally, the electors could be chosen in a variety of ways. Voters could choose them. They could choose them statewide. They could choose them in districts. The state legislatures often chose them with no input from the people at all.
Wow.
But by 1836, this winner-take-all system had become very widespread. And that transformed the Electoral College, combined with pledging electors in advance, into not a system of proxy election or where people are deputized to vote on our behalf, but it transformed it into a mathematical equation. And this was something that the framers themselves, those who remained alive, objected to and talked about. And if you wouldn't mind, I've prepared some sources, printed them out. And if you'd like me to send you the links to these, the wonderful thing about today is you don't have to go digging around in dusty libraries to find these things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can attach them to the video.
Yeah. And so one of these is, I have to have my glasses for this, is in a letter from Alexander Hamilton in 1802. And this was, of course, after the election of 1800, which was quite a mess. And Hamilton was disturbed because Aaron Burr, a man he considered to be very dangerous, came within a whisker of achieving the presidency. And Hamilton wrote this letter to a member of Congress and talked about the Electoral College and the intrinsic demerits of the existing plan. He said, it proved to us how possible it is for a man in whom no party has confidence and who deserves the confidence of none by mere intrigue and accident to acquire the presidency, essentially. And also how it proved how serious a danger of convulsion and disorder is inherent or incident, he said, in the plan. So, in other words, he's saying this is a problematic plan. Now, what's interesting is that very often people who want to defend the Electoral College will quote Hamilton from 1788, so 14 years before, where he said the Electoral College is excellent. Well, he wasn't talking that way in 1802 after he'd seen how it had evolved some. Now, I will also note in this letter, Hamilton says that he thinks it's a sound principle to let the federal government rest as much as possible on the shoulders of the people and as little as possible on the state legislature. So I noticed your guest was stressing that the Electoral College was implemented to, I think he said, to protect the small states, but he shared absolutely not one bit of evidence that is why it was chosen. And I would love to hear what evidence he has for that. Now, the other thing I think that's really interesting is that a very vigorous movement arose to alter the Electoral College, to get rid of this winner-take-all feature. And it passed, an amendment passed the Senate, the U.S. Senate, and keep in mind that a constitutional amendment has to have 2/3 majority of both houses. So that's a very high bar. So this constitutional amendment, it looked a little different each time it passed. It passed 4 times in 13 years, passed the Senate with a 2/3 majority, and it came within 6 votes of passing the House. And in the midst of one of those debates in Congress, Rufus King. Now, I would expect no one listening knows who Rufus King was, and that's not a surprise, and you shouldn't feel bad about that.
Okay.
But I will tell you that Rufus King was a delegate, one of the important delegates at the Constitutional Convention in 1787. At the time, he represented Massachusetts. But 1816, 28 years later, he'd had an illustrious career, served as John Adams' ambassador to Great Britain. Now he's back. He's residing in New York, and he is the U.S. Senator from the state of New York. So here's a man speaking in the U.S. Senate about the work that he and his colleagues had done 28 years before. And he's speaking on an amendment about the Electoral College, to alter the Electoral College. And here's what he says. He says, "We all know the course which this thing," he's talking about the Electoral College, "has taken. The election of a president of the United States is no longer that process which the Constitution contemplated." He's telling, we don't do it as we laid it out. And then he says that he would, left to him, as thoroughly as possible, restore the freedom of election to the people. He goes on to call the current system pernicious or dangerous. And so those are just a few, some of the evidence that I have that people, Americans have never been really satisfied with this system and have sought to change it. Over 700 amendments to the Constitution to alter the Electoral College have been introduced in Congress.
Not one has obviously
passed both houses. No.
Yeah, passed both houses. What would the framers, if they were sitting here? Well, then again, we don't know what they would think. But given their writings or they would not be happy with what they're. I'm assuming, and it's bad to assume, not be happy with what they're seeing today. I'm possibly.
So I don't think so, because, and the reason I say that is because many of them commented. So I know of at least 4 framers who commented, and these are only among those who were still alive, on either how it had changed or that they supported the changes that were being proposed in the 1810s and 1820s. James Madison is one of those. So I think that, they would be disturbed, and justly so. And one of the reasons that was articulated over and over and over during this conversation about changing the Electoral College was that it allowed a person who didn't have the support of the majority of the people to be elected president. And that is clearly not what the framers intended. It was not a device that was, you often hear, and I cringe every time I hear it, that the Electoral College was an anti-majoritarian device, or that it was instituted for the tyranny of the majority. And not a single framer ever talked about it in that way. And it's all, if I can point out about that, the tyranny of the majority is not a problem of how we elect people, because the framers were very clear. They said over and over, majorities win elections. You can only be tyrannical once you're in office. And the framers never chose some kind of funky workaround for the majority to win elections. They put limits on what majorities could do once they were in office. And by the way, the tyranny of the majority always referred to a legislature, never to a president. So, yeah. So, I'm like you. I don't ever want to say what the framers would say, but we know that many of them who were alive when these amendments were being proposed supported these changes.
So when people say and they argue, about the smaller states and big states, that wasn't even a discuss. That wasn't even in their frame of mind back. They weren't thinking, obviously.
Well, so this was another thing that I objected to that your guest said. First of all, he really minimized the support for popular election that was in the Constitutional Convention, and I noticed that he said only almost exact words. Only one guy from Pennsylvania voted for it. Well, that's just a patent falsehood, because we don't know how individuals voted in the Constitutional Convention. They recorded the vote only by states.
Okay.
And it's right here in James Madison's notes. You can pick up a copy online for $5. And I know the exact vote he's talking about on July 17th. And the entire delegation of Pennsylvania voted for it. That was an 8-member delegation that included Ben Franklin. Now, I will also say that James Madison repeatedly said he preferred popular election. Other representatives said they preferred popular election. So, I think that when people make errors like that, it's clear they maybe haven't read the sources. And it's also clear that maybe they have an agenda. And honestly, the gentleman went on to overstate the number of people who voted for or against popular election, saying 54 people voted against popular election. Well, that's also patently false because there were not even 54 people present that day. There were only 10 state delegations. And so, so these details, it's not to be picky, but it's about the overall portrayal that we're giving of the Electoral College. Let me point out one other thing. They took a variety of votes on different methods, and 4 times they rejected an Electoral College plan. So, it is true that at the end they made a last minute switcheroo, but they had decided. I think your guest said they hadn't decided. Oh no, they had decided. They had repeatedly chosen that or voted that Congress would choose the president. But they understood that it was problematic because that compromises, I think you can see, the separation of powers. And, but, at the time, 10 states elected their governors by their legislature. So it was fairly common. And so they had this kind of weird thing going on where they say, let's have Congress choose the president. Oh, but that's a problem. But then they vote for it. So they're like dogs chasing their tails. And then near the end, one legislator, Gouverneur Morris of Pennsylvania, said, hey, let's let a committee work this out. And that's where Madison worked out the Electoral College plan as we have it. So they only approved of one that worked a very specific way, which I think is then problematic to say it's changed and doesn't work that way. It's what the framers wanted. No, it just absolutely isn't. And then let me just say one other thing, and that is that Madison said that the method chosen was the most expedient until I forget the word he used, but it was basically until we figure out a better one.
Oh.
So it wasn't like there was a deep commitment on principle to this plan.
Wow. And we have obviously several elections recently where, Hillary Clinton did get more votes than Donald Trump and so forth. They would be going back to their readings and their writings. I mean, did they envision something like that happening?
Well, so the framers of the Constitution, no, that's not what they were trying to create. Remember, they're creating a proxy election, and they thought there would be just many, many different candidates.
Yeah.
So no, they didn't envision that at all. And maybe this is a good place for me to mention, something that's said very, very often, was said on your program that night, that if we didn't have the Electoral College, New York and California would dominate every election. Now, why do you think people say that?
It just, population or the political party. I mean,
okay. You're exactly right. So population, but New York and California are not the 2 most populous states. The two most populous states are California, absolutely, and Texas.
Texas, that's what I was. Oh, really? Yeah,
Yes,
I see.
yes,
You don't, New York City, biggest city, but when it comes to states, Texas is a pretty. I mean, Houston and San Antonio.
yes.
Okay, so
Well,
that argument's kind of then thrown out.
bogus. Because
Yeah,
let me say some more about that. New York isn't even the third most populous state. Florida is. Uh,
and
New
growing.
York, the fourth most populous state. And so, I think that talking point is thrown out there to scare rural and right-leaning voters that they're going to be overwhelmed by the liberal East Coast. And so let me say, let me just dig down into some numbers and tell you what's really true about that. In California, absolutely, California is the most populous state by a lot. But how many Trump voters do you think there are in California in 2020? How
I'd
many
have
do
to
you
go
think
back
there
and
were?
I'd have to go back and look at the numbers, but
Sure.
there are Trump voters there.
34% voted
Wow,
for Trump. That is
wow,
6 million votes. And those votes were given to Joe Biden.
yeah,
And so that happens every election. So giving all the electors to one candidate not only cancels out the vote of the political minority in the state, it actually gives their vote to the candidate they do not want. And
yeah.
that's kind of galling. I find it very galling.
And it could
Um,
impact both parties. I mean, 20, 30 years from now, if things stay the same, the political will could be turned. I mean, we don't know, how
yes.
things are going. So this party may not like the system now. Things might change in my lifetime. I'm 48 years old, and when my 6-year-old is my age, who knows what the political world will be at that
That,
point?
that's exactly right. And the other talking point that goes with this is that rural people, the Electoral College supports rural people. No, it doesn't, because those 6 million Trump voters in California were mostly, not all, but mostly rural. There are, I think it's 2.25 million rural voters in New York that had their votes given to the candidate they
Yeah,
didn't support. About the same number, really in Illinois, in fact, in most states. And so we've got a system right now that is not accurately representing the wishes of the people, and that's something I do know the framers wanted.
and also the candidates, they campaign the system as it is now.
Yes.
If things were changed, they would campaign differently, because I lived in Alabama and I remember or certain states, they don't see even a campaign visit from certain people because of the
No.
Electoral College and the votes and so forth. I remember I was in Alabama, I think, when President Obama was elected. I don't think he ever came to
No.
Alabama because it was just assuming it's Republican. I have no chance. So if things were changed, the way they campaigned would change, I would assume, too.
Well, it absolutely would. And I'll tell you one other thing that would change. And this may be the most significant reason why I will just say I support changing it. Now, I'm not a big fan of the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact that's going around. I think we need a constitutional amendment, and that's really hard. But the thing I think that would be most significant is right now our political parties are, I think most people agree, absolutely dysfunctional. They are brittle and rigid, and most people want more options. But it's the political parties are actually, through state law, kind of grafted into this system, and they have a lot of control about who our choices end up being. And because of the Electoral College, a third party candidate is always a spoiler, and so that prevents third parties from rising. But wouldn't it be wonderful if we actually had more options? And the idea that all Americans fit into one of two political boxes, I don't think so. If you agree with everything in your party, you're probably not thinking. And so I think that would be much better if we had the ability to make coalitions around certain issues and didn't feel, well, if I take this issue, I've also got to have this issue, and I don't really like this issue, but this one's more. So I think it would change our political system, and I think that'd be welcome right now.
Yeah, and you say to get to that point, you don't see that happening anytime in the near future because the
Oh,
hurdle to get to that point for
so high.
Congress, both the Senate and the House, and it doesn't look promising in that would change anytime soon.
So you're right. I think it's, it is really a high bar, but I guess hope springs eternal. And I'm, the optimist in me says, let's get this party started. let's
Or
let's work to make it happen.
will the
I'm,
people speak? I've been looking over the last couple days, and a lot of people are opining that if we had a Trump Biden, there's some people who would be more interested in a third choice.
yes,
That would be interested. So
but
maybe
you know
as
what'll happen to that?
what would happen?
Well, first of all, what will happen is the parties will smack them down
Oh
because
yeah,
they don't want that.
yeah.
And then the other thing is, what can happen, and it's actually happened twice, and then there have been a few efforts to make it happen, is that the third party candidate gets enough votes and no one gets to 270, no one gets a majority, and then the election goes to the House of Representatives. And in the House of Representatives, they vote by states. So it is very undemocratic. So, I live in Kentucky, they'd get one state. California would get one state. Rhode Island would get
Wow.
one vote. So, and the framers actually they designed that contingency election system, and then they came to really not like it at all.
I think
Um,
that would really
make
upset
Americans mad.
people. I
Yes,
would think because then their
yes,
votes would be one vote and their yeah that could cause chaos amongst the masses.
yes. And I don't want to be an alarmist.
Yeah.
And I think we have so much media right now that just thrives on alarming people at how awful the opposition is, and that's not helpful. I do think because our country is so divided and passions are so high that we could have, I hope not, but I do worry sometimes about a big catastrophe in 2024. But I do want to just say the last time we had a constitutional amendment pass one house or the other was 1969, and it passed overwhelmingly in the House. In fact, with 81% of the House voting for it, and it was bipartisan. Um, so both parties have at times really embraced this. In the 19th century, in the Reconstruction era, it was really pushed by Republicans because they were pursuing the equality of the recently freed people. And what they came to determine was we're not actually all equal until all our votes are equal. And our votes for president right now are not equal.
True. Well, and that's what the more we talk about this for those
Yes.
who want change, that may be what brings it about to have a very a good discussion and someone like yourself taking away people who are tied to specific pushes, but just looking back on things and putting it into perspective. So that's why I wanted to give you the opportunity to talk about it because there's a lot of things that we take as gospel or we
Yes.
take as oh that's what the framers didn't want the smaller states and as you say now that they didn't even that wasn't even part of their what they were thinking and there's a lot of misnomers that you don't even know that's misinformation.
Right. That's right. And why would you? Not everybody has time to spend their days reading James Madison. Fortunately,
Exactly.
the Eastern Kentucky University pays me to read James Madison.
Yeah.
But and I would say if we had time for a longer conversation, there's a tiny piece of it that's connected to the states, but to suggest that that's the driving motivation is utterly wrong.
What suggestions would you have for people who want to see a difference to make a change? Is it obviously get involved to, what would you suggest? What could, if you want there to see a change, what can we do for those who want to see a change to get there? What needs to happen or what
Yeah.
can people do to push that?
So a lot needs to happen. I mean, this is a
Yeah.
big hill to climb. And if I had easy answers to that, um, I'd be a rich woman. Um,
Yeah.
so for me, it began in my curiosity, and the next thing I knew, I was writing a book about the Electoral College, and I'm hoping it comes out next year. And it's one reason that I got in touch with you, because I want to talk to as many people as I can.
Yeah.
I think that um, you know when the last time there was a constitutional amendment in 1969, George Wallace had scared both political parties, and that's one of the reasons why um, that amendment passed. Now, if we need another scare, maybe. I don't want it, but I think I think the main thing is become informed, and if you hear something, uh, te- you know, you don't have to get mad at the person if they don't agree with you, but really find a source, go to the sources. If you read a book about the Electoral College, well, read one maybe that offers a different view and see which one supports their case better from the evidence. That would be a good place to start. I think, information, people need information right now. And this
But
is
I
not
mean,
about, I'm sorry, go ahead.
the same thing with me with media. I will watch MSNBC, CNN, Fox, all of them, and bring it together. And it's amazing how different things are different. But you're right. Just don't just go with your side or what you think is. Broaden your horizons. Critical thinking.
Well, absolutely. And, I will say that one of the things that the research has demonstrated is that people who only get news in their silo actually are dumber about the issues. They know less because every issue is complicated. And maybe that's actually the last thing I want to say. If people can explain it in talking points, they're probably missing a lot or leaving
Exactly.
out a lot. So
Well, send me the link you had or the link. I will put them on the
I will.
video.
I
And
will.
I just want to thank you for taking the time.
Thank you so much for having me. I've enjoyed this conversation so much.